I used to get complaints about the books in the background of my video. I used to get hate mail that I was just putting the books on camera to seem intelligent when I wasn't. And right now in the background, 100% fake bookery being shown off. On the lower level, that's my girlfriend's Chinese language textbook, the textbook my girlfriend's learning to use Chinese. And then above it is a book I hate and resent, a real disappointment. It's Thucydides, but it's the landmark edition of Thucydides, which in my opinion is a real rip-off edition of Thucydides. That's showing off. Of course, if I just turned the camera this way, thered be a whole stack of books showing on the other part of my desk here. But, anyway, oh, great. Lighting tech, whatever. All right, sabotaging my own video here. We continue apace. Morty, get the lights. Morty, no? All right. Okay. Perfect. That's just the way I wanted it. All right. Look, guys. I just wrapped a long video talking about circumcision and 5 or 6 different intersecting ethical and political issues related to Western cultural attitudes towards circumcision, progressive scientific knowledge, etc., and all of them have parallels with veganism. The most important issue I left out of that video, which was spontaneous and unscripted, just like this video I'm doing now, no prep, no rehearsal, etc., no edits. What I left out there was the question of the separation of church and state. And that's a really interesting, important issue that is part of the approach of this guy, Eric, oh God, what's the name? Eric Klopper. I have an extensive staff of interns here backing up these videos. Thank you for your fact-checking, intern. Eric Klopper. Eric Klopper does draw attention to the fact that part of the problem in the United States of America, in contrast to some other countries, what he calls more enlightened countries in Northern Europe, is the tradition of the separation of church and state. Separation of church and state, as a concept and as an actual set of laws and standards of practice and principles, impacts organizing, activism on every level, in every way, not just for something like circumcision, also something like veganism, many other issues we might want to engage with. The American tradition is really peculiar because it emerged out of more than a century of debate in England that was punctuated by the English Civil War. Now, the English Civil War, I just mentioned this. Americans will always talk about Puritans and Puritanism. And normally, in the context of American history, the Puritans are described as being sort of dissident intellectuals who opposed the status quo in England and who were escaping as some kind of persecuted minority in England. You could actually say the Puritans are represented in American history kind of parallel to Jews escaping persecution in Spain with the Spanish Inquisition, as if this was a persecuted religious minority. Now, of course, there's some truth to that, like most historical fictions, but that's incredibly misleading. The real experience that people in England had with the Puritans was precisely that the Puritans had taken over political power briefly, but with devastating impacts during the period of the English Civil War. So the Puritans went from being a group that was maybe easy to idealize or easy to glamorize to being hated and feared and resented. So give a couple examples really quick to flesh this out. It's very easy to idealize the notion that the government should not have control over prayer, that there shouldn't be a standardized book of prayer printed by the government and then forced upon the people of all of England. Now, you can make a rational argument for that, whether you're an atheist or a true believer or what have you. It's very easy to present a philosophical political argument that makes this sound like very straightforward debate to win. But the actual experience of the Puritans abolishing the English Book of Common Prayer was so disastrous, so oppressive, and so terrible. What the Puritans did with popular Christianity in England, which included, by the way, banning Christmas, banning Easter, banning all of the popular ceremonies and festivals, getting rid of the English Book of Common Prayer, yes, but also replacing it with a horrible, openly elitist system of church services that presumed to separate the people who were going to go to heaven after they died, the people who were confirmed as among the elect from the common run of man, were really denigrating and insulting to everyone. It made everyone's lives miserable, frankly, in the church they took over. It was so awful, and also the enthusiasm was so great that the common run of men in England had demonstrated to them that the state control of religion was not so much something that was forcing people to be more religious than they otherwise would be. But in England, in those centuries at that time, it was, if anything, kind of protecting the indifferent mass of Englishmen, of moderately religious people, from zealots and enthusiasts and extremists. And then out of this came a unique discourse. This is a uniquely British discourse about politics, of going back and looking at the Old Testament, especially the book of Judges, looking at, and by the way, this is even found within the famous book Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, inquiring into what is the role of kingship and government in the Old Testament in the light of this historical experience, and coming to the conclusion that was very influential, but maybe just for a century, it didn't last that long, that the other nations of Europe had missed the point of the Bible, in that the Bible contained within it a powerful criticism of tyrannical kings who sought to control religion, and that instead what they ought to have is not quite a democracy of faith, but the freedom for different small Protestant groups to set up and operate their own churches, etc., etc. Now, during the period of what's called the dictatorship in England, so this period after the English Civil War, this was debated extensively, and the conclusions they came to were dissatisfactory to everyone. But there was a long struggle of the Puritans within England, in which they made themselves and their ideas incredibly unpopular. And it's true, many of them, I have no idea what percentage, a significant number of Puritans escaped to America, where their ideas didn't meet with the same resistance, and where there was just some more empty space for them to unpack their ideas and set up their own idealized communes and communities and miniature dystopias. So those ideas got to play themselves out in American history. But the really lasting idea that shaped the American Constitution, and this idea of church and state as it exists in the United States today, was that the truest form of Christianity, and again, this is not for the sake of secularism, not for the sake of the progress of science, it was for the purity of Christianity itself as they conceived of it, that the truest form of Christianity was allowing these congregations to set up their own autonomous authorities, independent authorities, what have you. Now, there is no way for me to express to you the intensity of hatred that Puritans and many of these Protestant groups at that time had, towards the existence of bishops within the Anglican Church. To them, any kind of structured higher authority like this was recreating Catholicism within the Protestant faith. Intense hatred of bishops, intense hatred of the government creating something like the English Book of Common Prayer, a standard guide, which really included things like implicitly about how different kinds of holidays were supposed to be celebrated, what kind of songs and dances you would do at Christmas and Easter and other festivals, and of course also prayers and homilies and things that were recited and chanted in church. This was intensely hated, and it was in reaction against that and to establish a very different idea of orthodoxy and religious purity that separation of church and state was created in America. Now, this explains why. Tell me this. Was there any freedom of religion for African American slaves? Zero. Was there any freedom of religion in the United States of America for indigenous Americans, for Native Americans, for the Mohawks, for the Navajo, for any of the Algonquian groups on the East Coast there? The Lenape, to give a specific group. The Lenape were indigenous to what's now Manhattan, and they're now completely extinct, by the way. Did those peoples have, even religious toleration? No. This concept of separation of church and state was, if anything, quite an intolerant concept. And anyone who's familiar with American history knows they had a very difficult time even accommodating the presence of papacy, of the Catholic Church. It wasn't clear how this doctrine would be applied there. So out of this tradition now, we have this idea, which is completely different from a country like modern Germany. So Germany at present, the concept is that a religion is not allowed to preach or practice principles that are contrary to the fundamental tenets of Germany's own constitution. Germany's own constitution is normally referred to as the Basic Law. So that there's a set of principles that are so fundamental that is where religious freedom ends. Yeah? So an example like circumcision raises exactly those kinds of questions. Are there some decisions that churches are not allowed to make in the name of church authority? Are there some decisions that violate basic human rights or even just basic ideas of decency? Most modern Western countries, I note, will not allow you to tattoo a child or a minor. Right? And a tattoo is in many ways less damaging than circumcision, genital mutilation, etc. Right? But there's no real discourse or debate about this. It is completely unacceptable. To my knowledge, all 50 states in the United States, the age will differ, but under age 16 or under age 18, whatever the age is, it's only when the person receiving the tattoo can take responsibility and consent to getting the tattoo, even if in your state it's 14. I'm sure it does vary by a few years here and there, just like the age of consent for other things does. You can only receive a tattoo beyond a certain age. It's egregiously obvious that this same principle could be applied to circumcision as opposed to circumcision being outlawed. Absolutely. I had a conversation recently with Ask Yourself, Isaac, on Discord, and this came up as an illustration, as an example in the conversation. It wasn't the main substance of the conversation. But I pointed out to him that the people we were debating with antinatalists. Antinatalists were advancing their argument under the delusion that they knew some fact so simple and of such overwhelming importance that if others knew this fact, they would immediately agree with the argument presented. They'd come into conformity with the values espoused by their position. And I pointed out now, the particular debate we're having, I don't feel the other side had any such facts to appeal to. We're talking about antinatalists and their particular view of life and suffering and childbirth and their philosophy of life, basically. I don't think it was based on any such outstanding fact. Now, it's tragic. It's truly tragic and heartbreaking to be in that position when in fact you are. It is tragic to live in a community where people are huffing glue. And very often it is children, but let's say whether it's minors huffing glue or elderly people huffing glue, if you see children who are huffing glue, inhaling glue fumes, so that they can feel a momentary pleasure of the glue as it evaporates into their bloodstream and affects their brain chemistry, and you know this is going to impair their intelligence for the rest of their lives, it's going to have this terrible impact for the rest of their lives. You know this outstanding fact, and you don't just want to engage in public outreach and conversation and kind of happy, relaxed conversation. You want to make it illegal. You want to use force. You want to intervene now. You don't want these young people to ruin their lives or ruin the lives of others. And you can say from your position, if only this person knew what I knew, and this is the most tragic part, and if only they were thinking about this rationally and with detachment, if they knew what I know, they wouldn't make this decision. They'd make a different decision. And now here's the really dangerous, tragic step. And then you're taking the dictatorial, authoritarian step of saying, therefore, I am going to presume to make that decision for you. I am going to decide, and I'm going to go to the government, whatever it is. Maybe you live in a democracy, maybe you live in a dictatorship. Somebody in authority is going to decide, you don't get to make this decision anymore. We're going to make huffing glue illegal. We're going to stop you. We're going to use force, etc. And, I don't have a word. What is the threshold we have to pass? What is the standard before we can take that step? Because we know that about myriad things. How do you feel when in your community you see a pregnant woman drinking red wine. Every single glass of red wine she takes is causing brain damage and other developmental damage to the baby, to the unborn infant that she's pregnant with. And not only have I met and spoken to people about this, and it's real hard to be detached and compassionate and caring, to not walk out of someone and say, do you realize what a terrible person you are? Do you realize how you're utterly failing to take responsibility for the consequences of your action? Oh, let's do some compassionate, engaged outreach and education here, people. It's a challenge. How do you feel when you talk to a medical doctor? A medical doctor who is advising women that it's okay for them to drink wine or drink beer, say 3 drinks a day. That advice is still commonly given and does unbelievable harm. It does harm to the women themselves. It does harm to their unborn infants and to the next generation of human beings in a country like Canada. And by the way, basically brain damage caused by alcohol during pregnancy is at epidemic proportions in Canada. Canada's in the list of countries where this is a huge, huge problem. All right? And you're not in a position with these examples where you can say, you can be a reducitarian. You can just say, oh, well, maybe if you just cut down, maybe if it's only 3 glasses of wine, maybe if you cut it down to 2 glasses of wine. No, you can sit there with the electrocardiogram with various forms of scanners, and you can watch the woman drinks a glass of red wine and the baby's heart rate goes down, and the impact is obvious, right? Or you can do ultrasound and so on too. This stuff is not real mysterious. And yes, you can look up peer-reviewed medical literature, blah, blah, blah. And you can even find, anyway. At some point, the culture of open-ended discourse and debate, of pluralism, that's ultimately what we're talking about here. I mean, the culture that the American tradition of separation of church and state tried to foster is not really one of freedom, of religious freedom. It's one of pluralism, of having a plurality of independent churches, each one being just as authoritarian as all the others. Each one gets to write its own prayer book, define its own ceremonies, decide who's going to heaven, who's going to hell. And if you don't like it, you can choose not to donate money to this church. You can donate money to that church instead, right? And yet we come up against these hard facts that make it impossible for us to be pluralists, make it impossible for us to be congenial and flexible and accepting and say, oh, well, everyone gets to make up their own minds, right? You're allowed to have your own beliefs, but you're not allowed to have your own facts. This is what makes it so terrible to deal with examples like circumcision and the lifelong consequences that has for an infant. Examples like fetal alcohol syndrome, women who are pregnant drinking alcohol. Examples like the use of myriad mind-altering drugs that have long-term impact on your brain. And I hate to tell you this, guys, it's not just party drugs. It's not just cocaine. It's not just marijuana. Antipsychotic drugs, anti-anxiety medications, antidepressants. These can have unbelievably terrible long-term consequences for your cognitive function. And they're used on an epidemic scale. I mean, what do you want to say? Male circumcision, male genital mutilation is also on an epidemic scale. And yes, for us as vegans, if you are vegan, if you've even thought about the ecological, ethical, and health consequences of where food comes from, for the billions of human beings who populate this planet, relying on many billions more of animals living on a concrete floor in a steel cage, until the day their throats are cut and their blood pours through a metal grill on the floor to be collected and desiccated and turned into fertilizer, powdered blood in bags. We live in a world full of these hard facts that make that culture of pluralism impossible, and where we ultimately have to look to government to be responsible for what is in our best interests, despite what we want. People want to continue tribalistic traditions that involve mutilating their children. Perhaps in some examples, tattooing their children. Much less harmful, but another case where The long arm of the law intervenes in parental authority. We have the government intervening in all of these things with the inevitability of a can of tomato soup rolling down a staircase. From my perspective, if you live in a democratic society, it is only a matter of time and a question of how much tomato soup is going to leak out of this can, how much blood is going to be spilled, how much harm is going to be done, how many lives are going to be ruined before you make the hard decisions to make these things illegal, to have those legal reforms. And the heartbreaking thing as an activist, as someone trying to do public education and outreach, is that you know the consequences. You know that they can't wait. I reach out to people with a kind of love because I choose to pretend that even if they've done terrible things in the past, they have the potential to do something positive in the future. I choose to behave as if I judge them, not by their past actions, but by their potential to do good in the future. In many ways, I despise the whole history of the British Empire. It's despicable. The British Empire was built on slavery in one era, it was built on genocide in another, and it was built on opium trading in another era still. It's unbelievable. But when I look today at the societies that the collapse of the British Empire produced, the United States, Canada, Australia, etc., I see a lot of potential. I see a lot of potential to do good just in the next 20 years, in the next 50 years. We can turn this around, guys. We can take this society and we can lead the way on important issues like veganism, like circumcision, like human rights, like democracy. We can lead the way on these issues even though they're in no way part of our cultural, legal, and political tradition. I'll say that again. Even though they are in no way a part of our legal, cultural, and political tradition, in the same sense that gay marriage and gay rights were not a part of our legal and cultural tradition until one day they were. In the 21st century, that's our struggle. I hope you'll join me. À-bas-le-ciel.